another episode of the BioHub. Today, we're delighted to welcome Aaron Royston, who's a managing partner at venBio and a leader in the life sciences venture world. With a background that spans medicine, business, and biotech investing, Aaron has played a key role in building companies like Apellis, RayzeBio, Ventyx Biosciences, Akero Therapeutics, and Harmony Biosciences. And he holds an M.D. and M.B.A. from the University of Pennsylvania. And early in his career, he was recognized by the White House as a champion of change for his work in tech and innovation. So join us today as we'll walk through venBio's story, Aaron's role in several high-profile acquisitions, as well as venBio's latest fund. So Aaron, thanks so much for coming on. How are you?
Good, and thank you so much for having me. You've had a great roster of people before me, so definitely humbled to join as well.
Yeah, look, it's an absolute pleasure. So let's just start off with a little bit about your journey then. So can you share your background from being a physician to becoming a venture capitalist, and what made you motivated to make that transition?
Yeah, absolutely. So like many young people who go into medicine, I think I was motivated by two things primarily. The first was a deep curiosity about biology and how living systems work and what drives disease. The second was a motivation to use that knowledge to make an impact on the world and try to help people. And so those things initially steered me to the University of Pennsylvania for medical school. Similar motivations actually ultimately drew me to running clinical research at Mount Sinai Medical Center. I was really stimulated by research because I felt that elucidating novel biology and medical discoveries was a way to contribute, towards helping a lot of people with a given disease versus, let's say, one-on-one patient care. However, as we know, getting research going can be slow at times, and it's often reliant on government grants, which can have long processes and timelines to apply for funding and can be quite bureaucratic. And so what really ultimately drove me to biotech and venture capital was the ability to raise funds and directly pour gasoline right into the engine of research and turn scientific discoveries into real medicine in a rapid way. Ultimately, if you can just turn those discoveries into FDA approved therapies, you can literally help millions of people. And so I think that broad scale of what we were working on or could be working on was really motivating for me. In addition to those drivers, I've always been drawn to investing, I would say, in general, which I've done personally, dating back to college and medical school, whether it was public stocks or actually sports betting, which, the latter is probably best stories told over drinks sometimes. But, I've always been excited by finding value and comfortable taking risk if I was confident in my analysis and point of view. And so combining some of those specific motivations around medical science and helping patients, I think biotech VC just ended up being, a really nice fit for me.
Very good. And venBio, you guys have had a lot of success since its founding in 2011. Can you walk us through how the firm grew to approximately 2 billion under AUM? Sure.
And thanks for the comment. So the firm was launched in 2011 by my partners, Rob and Corey. And coming out of the financial recession, as you can imagine, it was a very challenging time to put together a first-time vehicle. And so the way that they were able to do that was actually with a fairly unique LP base, which comprised mostly strategic pharma as limited partners in the first fund. Those relationships were extremely beneficial. They still are today. And as we think about exit opportunities, therapeutic areas of interest for pharma, maybe most specifically, what data do you need to generate to really catalyze pharma BD and mitigate their concerns? All of that was very beneficial. Of course, Pharma's capital also was a means for us to develop a track record early on. And so we're very grateful for that. In our second fund, we started to add more financial investors in addition to pharma. And when it came to our third fund in 2018, we decided to carve back pharma to a much smaller percentage of the fund. And the goal was to diversify the LP base to a variety of more financially motivated investors. University endowments, pension plans, foundations, family offices, financial institutions, et cetera. Because pharma would be much lower percentage of the fund at that time. We actually started that fundraise from a much lower base of capital in 2018. And so this actually ended up being a pretty heavy lift for my partners and I. I think back to that year, I think probably traveled over 250 days that year, flying around the country and the world, meeting with potential new LPs. And there were a lot of highs and a lot of lows of that year. Actually, it was a particularly challenging personal time for me. I just had my first baby. My wife's father also just had a heart attack, unfortunately, and was in the ICU for many months, ultimately getting an artificial heart. And so, it entailed that year, days spent in the ICU, to a red eye to the East Coast for a fundraising pitch, and then back that same day because I had a newborn at home. And, I know many GPs and CEOs have had those points in their career or business where it really takes a full-blown sprint to get the organization to a point of stability. And when I look back, it was really one of those times for us and me personally. But anyway, fortunately, after a pretty long and challenging fundraise, we ended up with a successful outcome and some really, truly fantastic limited partners joining us in that fund. We've been really fortunate that since Fund 3, we've had a very consistent LP base as we went on to close Fund 4 and then Fund 5 in the subsequent years. And with those two funds, we've only added a handful of new LPs each fund. And we're very fortunate to raise those in pretty quick fashion over just a few months. And so, it feels like our firm has achieved a lot of stability since that diversification of LPs in 2018. But yeah, it's certainly been an evolution in the investor base as we've grown over the last 15 years.
Okay, and what strategies in particular have been key to the success?
Yeah, good question. I would say, as a starting point, again, a big part of our success is the support of an amazing set of LPs, most of which have joined us over the past 3 funds. I hope what gives them confidence is our discipline when it comes to fund management and building our portfolio. For each of our funds, our goal is to make 10 to 12 investments. And so we've sized the funds accordingly for that. While we've had some growth in fund size over the years, I bet it's mostly in line, with increased costs in biotech and increases in typical round sizes. But we think this portfolio size of 10 to 12 companies is really the right number to diversify our funds, while also allowing us to be extremely selective and getting involved with each of our companies that we're helping to build. I think our LPs have really appreciated our discipline on fund size, and particularly despite times when we could have raised significantly more capital. We're also, very focused on building companies in therapeutic areas where you can clinically validate the treatment within 3 to 5 years. And so this gives us and our companies a lot of optionality, and we don't necessarily have to rely on private markets being receptive for biotech for long durations. And so this has really helped us drive liquidity in tough macro environments. And lastly, probably most importantly, we're focused on treatments that can prove they meaningfully affect patient outcomes. If you could show that a treatment helps patients with an unmet medical need, you'll almost certainly be financially rewarded for that. And so, this really allows us to do well for our LPs by doing well for patients. And I think my colleagues and I take a lot of pride both in the returns that we generate, but also as well as the drugs we've brought to market.
Very good. And you've personally led investments into some very successful companies: Akero Therapeutics, RayzeBio, Harmony Biosciences, Apellis, Ventyx Biosciences, and many others. You mentioned the fund, typically you'll invest in maybe 10 companies or so. How did you find and identify those opportunities initially?
Yeah, it's a great question. And maybe actually helpful to run through, some of these just to give you a sense for the different channels. So actually, both Akero Therapeutics and RayzeBio originated from a good friend, Aaron Kantoff, reaching out actually with an idea or a therapeutic area he was assessing and starting to put a company together. I've known Aaron K for over a decade, years before we started working together formally. He's a brilliant company builder who has a genuine knack for identifying emerging areas of medicine and areas that will be of interest, to investors in pharma. In both of those cases, these were therapeutic areas we had already followed closely, and so we were well prepared to assess the value prop and move quickly. Akero and Rayze have gone on to do some really great things in their respective areas, totally in thanks to the CEOs, Andrew and Ken, respectively. So Aaron Kay and I are actually working on we're trying our luck again, building another new company, which is currently in stealth mode, but hope to share more about that later this year. Ventyx is a funny one. It started with a conversation on a biotech surf trip, actually, when the chief business officer of Ventyx, Chris, explained the work he was doing on various immunology targets that were actually each in single asset shell companies. And his team's goal was to develop each of these very cheaply and try to sell them to pharma. And so actually over a few margaritas, Chris and I discussed the potential synergies of bringing assets together with the appropriate funding and leadership. And ultimately, my colleague and I worked with Ventyx to put the assets together into a new co with a much larger vision and raise capital to build a leading immunology company. Harmony was introduced by a mutual friend in the industry that I've worked with for many years, dating back to my days at Vivo Capital. Harmony was formed around a molecule that was found in Europe, and they really needed sophisticated and experienced biotech investors at the table for the new co-launch and build. Apellis came out of the University of Pennsylvania, where I trained, and was a company I'd followed for years before becoming an investor, actually. And so I'd gotten to know the CEO, Cedric, and the rest of the management team. And as they started de-risking their approach over time, was in a position to move pretty quickly to lead the financing. And so it was beneficial to have already developed a rapport with Cedric when it came time to fund the company from our perspective. So I guess as I reflect on these investments, I think one of the takeaways is that if you're able to consistently add value and bring much more than capital to the table, operators and company builders will want you to bring you into the fold early on. That, and I guess to surround yourself with brilliant people is I'm really fortunate to work with amazing company builders and co-investors in all of these examples. At the end of the day, it's truly really is just a relationship business. Also, and maybe lastly, just importantly, with each of these companies, we have proactively landscaped the relevant therapeutic area. We've developed core hypotheses and felt like we had a good sense for what pharma was looking for in these areas. And so if we hadn't already done that work and developed that internal conviction around these spaces, it would have been difficult to move quickly when the opportunities presented themselves. And so this actually enabled us to be founding Series A investors in many of those examples.
Okay. And I know you sit on the board of a number of the companies you've personally invested in. How much support do you give to those companies?
Yeah, it's probably a better question for the management teams of the companies to see how they answer it. But I would say, from my perspective, in most of these examples, the months immediately before and after the initial investment thesis are the times where we get really involved, primarily to help build the team and set the strategy. And the most important way we're really able to add value is helping find the right leaders for the organization. So for example, with Akero, we were able to convince Andrew Chang, who was the CMO, Chief Medical Officer of Gilead at the time, to leave his role to be the CEO of Akero. That set the company on a whole new trajectory, having Andrew and his ClinOps team from Gilead spearheading Akero's clinical development. They're truly gifted drug developers, and we're very fortunate to have them running the company. There's actually a funny story. I'll go a bit of a tangent here. So my wife, Sylvie, is a great cook. And I think I really started falling in love with her after she made me her sort of famous grilled lamb sandwich for the first time. And so when we were recruiting Andrew to be the CEO of Akero while he was still at Gilead, we had him over to our home in San Francisco for dinner. And my wife made the lamb sandwich. He joined the company not long after that. And so, the rest was history, as they say. I rolled off the board of Akero shortly after IPO, but Andrew went on to do incredible things with the company even since then. And it's a great molecule. It's now valued around $4 billion as a public company. And I guess something about the lamb sandwich gets people to commit. But a similar process actually happened with RayzeBio, kind of going down this theme. During the diligence process before the Series A, I spent a few months down in San Diego, and we were able to recruit to join Ken as CEO concurrent with the financing. Ken's an incredible operator, really just gifted, and he's now a close friend. And it was a long process to recruit him into an early endeavor like that, but definitely one of the most important and pivotal decisions we can make, and one of the best ways we can add value. That company's also went on to have a great trajectory, and I think Ken appreciates the value we bring to the table, and we're now working together on a new company called Akero Therapeutics that I serve on the board of. In general, I would just say one of the positive externalities that comes with being so actively involved with each company is that as long as you're adding value, investors and operators want to work with you again. And when I think about the CEOs we've discussed, whether it's Ken at Rayze, Andrew at Akero, John Jacobs at Harmony, Cedric at Apellis, the executive team from Ventyx, each of these leaders and leadership teams are really true friends outside of work and have been an important source of new investments now and guidance over time.
Very good. It must have been a great sandwich that your wife made.
Yeah, if you're ever in San Francisco, we're happy to see what we can do for you.
Yeah, for sure. And talk us through, so you've been in several high-profile acquisitions now. Can you talk us through, from a venture perspective, how you evaluate when a company is right for acquisition versus when you continue for independent growth?
Oh, that's a great question, and a bit nuanced. But generally, I would say I do believe in the adage that great companies are bought, not sold. Though, I would say a company can still prepare itself for a potential acquisition. When we make a new investment, we typically have a good amount of conviction around pharma's interest in the therapeutic area, and maybe most importantly, the types of data and capabilities the company needs to generate to demonstrate that to pharma to mitigate their concerns. As a board member, this is one of the important inputs as we develop our clinical development strategy and manufacturing plan. I would say, generally, pharma has great capabilities in late-stage development and commercialization. And so there could often be this natural partnering point that's a win-win after a biotech demonstrates clinical proof of concept data in earlier studies. However, having a viable path forward without a partnership required enables our companies to have leverage in these discussions and turn down options that we don't think are fair value. And so, many times over the years, my companies have received early M&A offers that we didn't think were fair value. And because we had a reasonable timeline and capital requirement to get to proof of concept data, we were able to independently get to the next catalyst. So with a case like RayzeBio, the company had significant capital on the balance sheet and a viable path forward as an independent company. And that allowed us to get a relatively lucrative acquisition offer from BMS because we had a go-forward strategy on our own. Ultimately, though, as we consider the shareholder return from the acquisition that was within 3.5 years or so from the launch of the company, it felt like a good outcome and a beneficial one to take for shareholders to take the transaction. But I still do feel sellers' regret at times, including with RayzeBio. And maybe one always feels this way when you sell a company that you're really confident in. But either way, that sentiment, I think, helps the negotiation.
Yeah. And can you talk us through, so venBio secured their latest fund last year, $528 million. What are the primary goals for that fund, and how do you plan to leverage it to drive future advancements in biomedicine?
Yeah, so I would say at a high level, the goal is consistent with prior funds. And that's really what we preach to our LPs as well. As mentioned, we plan to make 10 to 12 investments into companies that are focused on validated biologic targets. This means our companies will typically be developing novel treatment technologies or modalities, yet that allows us to leverage known disease biology. We expect the companies, as I discussed, will generate key de-risking data within 3 to 5 years, and are all in areas of key pharma interest. So we've now made our first few investments. While they're in stealth mode, I can say they're consistent with the discussion earlier and some of the points I just made. In each, we're working with co-investors and operators we've worked with in the past. For example, I think I touched on this. I'm now working with the same co-founder of both Akero and Rayze on a new company focused on hematology that we're really excited about. So if I could sum it all up, Fund 5 will be more of the same.
Okay. And managing a venture capital firm, I can imagine, comes with high pressure, intensive decision making. How do you personally handle that stress and maintain that focus?
Yeah, really, really great, insightful question. Well, surfing definitely helps. No, but honestly, I think having a background as a clinician helps put things in context. When treating, a patient who's very sick or dying, that could be a whole different level of stress and pressure. And I think helps put the stresses of investment firm management in a different light. And hopefully that doesn't imply, a lack of dedication or failing to take my responsibilities to our LPs very seriously. I take work very seriously. I'm truly passionate about what I do. But I actually think it's important to put work in context and not get too high or low as an investor. I've seen many investors burn out after failures as self-doubt sort of starts to creep in and they have a really hard time taking appropriate risk. And so, I think it's important to have confidence and trust in your decision-making, your strategy, your process, and know that you're not going to bat 100%. There was a recent speech by Roger Federer, I'm not sure if you saw, that where he said he's only won 54% of the points he's played during his career. And the key for his success was always thinking about the next serve. And so I think, as an investor, if you get too stressed by some of the hard times or outcomes, it can really be debilitating. And so perspective here, I think, can be beneficial.
Yeah. And last question for you. So your mindset and approach to work, I assume, are critical to what you do. What sets you apart from others in the field, and how do you consistently maintain that drive?
Yeah, so I think you're right that being an active board member, an investor, requires very challenging decisions at times. And I'm a firm believer that it's important to make decisions for the right reasons. And I've learned that if you do that and you tactfully communicate those reasons, hard feelings don't last after the emotions settle. And so, ironically, some of the decisions and outcomes that I'm most proud of are the ones that were the most challenging to go through, like shutting a company down early on when the biology is not working as expected, or terminating an operator. But it's deeply encouraging when those same operators and board members want to work with you again. And I think those tough decisions and conversations have been as important to my own success as some of the great outcomes. You also asked, how do I maintain my drive? And I think that comes from the fulfillment and gratitude that I feel in this role. Deeply grateful to our limited partners for entrusting us with their capital, and find a lot of fulfillment in honoring that trust. Many LPs have become very close personal friends of mine, and the long-term relationship that spans multiple funds, fosters a unique bond and trust that I deeply value. Many of our LPs are successful, incredibly successful operators and investors themselves. And so I think relying on them for advice is definitely a privilege. I also get a lot of fulfillment from the strong personal relationships that I built with the operators and co-investors on these journeys. And, whether it's Andrew Chang from Akero coming over to Pacifica, where I live, for a hike last week, or John Jacobs, who's the former CEO of Harmony, and I texting pictures of steaks that we cooked over the weekend. At the end of the day, it's all about the people you work with. And those relationships are formed through building a company together, and they're uniquely gratifying because you go through that journey together. And then lastly, I would say, bringing new treatments to patients in need is profoundly rewarding, and ties back to the beginning of our discussion about motivating to go into this space. I think I feel immensely fortunate to have contributed to building companies that have resulted in 6 FDA approvals, and hearing directly from patients about how these treatments have transformed their lives is incredibly motivating. So maybe, to wrap this up with a story on this topic, since I'm obviously very fond of telling stories. I was recently having lunch with Manu Hanan, who's the CEO of RayzeBio, a company I'm on the board of. We got together in London recently. Manu is an amazing drug developer who's dedicated his life to vaccine development. And so when I asked him, how's our clinical study going? His eyes lit up and he said, with this data, I believe our vaccine will improve many people's lives in the future. And that's how he gauges the company's success, how he gauges the success of his own career. And so I feel, incredibly privileged to collaborate with people like Manu in contributing to health outcomes. I'd say that's what really drives me at the end of the day.
Yeah, look, well, that was a terrific answer. And I think you've given a great perspective on how it is on the venture side, the growth at venBio. You've obviously had a lot of success with some of the companies that you've invested in, which I'm sure will continue as well. So look, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on, and thanks so much for helping us out. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Oh yeah, thanks so much for having me, and really great questions, and hope to speak with you soon.